Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Mike Piekarski, Rob Wilson, Tim Roberts, and Bo Sandoval. The five of us are going to be diving into grappling sports such as judo and jiu-jitsu and covering a variety of sport and return to sport considerations for rehab and strength and conditioning providers that work with this group. We cover a variety of different things, including return to sport and overall what makes the sport so unique and what you really need to know about the sport in order to successfully work with these athletes and provide for them. Episodes like this are made possible by our sponsors, ISOFIT and Oro Muscles. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training, and Oro Muscles has been my go-to for all of my service EMG needs. For more on the two of these companies, you can click below. Enjoy. Rob, Mike, Tim, Bo, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with the four of you today. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
For people who might not be familiar with the four of you, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the incredible things that you guys are doing in the sports performance and sports rehab world?
Sure. So my name is Mike Piekarski. I'm a doctor of physical therapy. I'm fairly unique because I'm also a jiu-jitsu black belt. I fought professional mixed martial arts. And on social media, I go by the handle Dr. Kickass, where I put a lot of info on rehab and how it relates to combat sports.
Bo Sandoval. I am a strength and conditioning coach, about 22 years worth of experience now, quite a few years in combative and acrobative sports, the national teams for freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling with the USOC, the wrestling program at the University of Michigan, directed all the S&C services for the UFC Performance Institute globally for about 5 years, and then continue to do some contract work just as a consultant, helping out with certain fight teams and some different jiu-jitsu competitors, wrestling competitors. But yeah, happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, I'm Tim Roberts. I'm a physiotherapist, Australian-trained physiotherapist and S&C coach. I've been with the UFC PI for the past 4 years, the first 3 in Shanghai and the last in our new Mexico City facility as the sports medicine manager. So most of my experience in combat sports has come from that, but also worked briefly in the Olympic systems in both China and the UK, and then had touches with combat sports, boxing, judo, and taekwondo and those as well. So most of my experience with the combat sports has been in the professional setting. So I guess that's a bit of context around where I'm going to come from with some of this information, but looking forward to the discussion.
First of all, I'm Rob Wilson. Currently, I mostly work with individuals in naval special warfare as a health educator. I have a background in strength and conditioning, manual therapy, been involved with martial arts personally pretty much my entire life in some form or another. Currently just a average jiu-jitsu nerd, but I do work with some notable athletes, including some ADCC and World Championship caliber competitors over the last couple of years. So happy to be here and hope to add some value to the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously for people listening, we're going to dive into martial arts in depth and detail. And today I really want to emphasize the grappling-based martial arts disciplines, in particular jiu-jitsu, judo, that sort of thing that way. And obviously, as you guys were talking, you mentioned that you all have extensive experience in this area, where whether you're a black belt like Mike or you have extensive experience working in this space as a strength coach or as a physio and so on that way. And I'm just really interested to hear, before we really get into the nitty gritty as it relates to rehab or return to sport, return to performance considerations for the martial arts athlete, what kind of things do you feel are really important for coaches and clinicians to know about this population? What is really essential to understand as it relates to the grappling sports of martial arts that way?
I'd probably say the simplest thing is that jiu-jitsu guys are idiots. And they're almost like drug addicts. I've been saying that pretty consistently lately. Is like they just need anyone to tell them they can go back to train, and they will. Like they don't care if it's some bullshit brace or whatever. Like they're going to be on the mat. So expect them to be stupid.
I would totally agree with that. I think the first thing you got to do is actually know know your athlete group even before you know the sport, because they're a unique breed. They'll you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. So it's understanding who they are, what they're going to do first, and then from there, obviously, you've got to have some awareness around the sport and their level of that sport, because it changes significantly when you're talking professional, or if you're talking about black belts versus white belts. It's a completely different sport. So it's understanding the sport, the different levels, and then from that you can start getting a little bit deeper into what stresses and strains and physical qualities the guys need. But I think you got to go back to the start first.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add too that they're durable, they're calloused, their tolerance is going to be quite a bit more than your average case walking through the door. So kind of understanding that there is a psyche to break through when you're educating in terms of what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what is competitive resiliency versus what is kind of stupidity, which is what these guys have referred to already. It's not intentional or malicious, but they have a voracious side to them where it's kind of woven in. You can't really have a successful pedigree in the sport without it. Understanding that so that you can bridge the gap between education, but also meeting some of their aggressive needs. And then outside of that, I can't say that once you get down the rabbit holes of assessing, identifying what's going on, and then what the road to recovery or what mitigation systems might look like. I can't say I haven't ever had any that weren't hungry for information. They do have a short attention span, so you better be ready to rifle off the information pretty quick. But outside of that, I mean, always and for me anyway, an enjoyable group to interact with. I've always had the fortunate experience to integrate with some pretty high level clinicians when it came to the medical side. So being able to offer sort of a different rationale from the performance side with helping them understand and digest the information so they can weaponize it a little bit sooner without having to be quite so bullheaded for so long. And that seems to be a good approach to have, not necessarily good cop, bad cop, but always a little bit of assurance that the process is doing its job. You just got to kind of ride it out and be true to it without cutting any corners.
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback on all of that, a couple things come to mind. I assume just based on the answers that everybody is talking about people who are competing at an extremely high amateur level or who are professionals, but I know the vast majority, unless you're working at a place like the PI or USOC or you're dealing with a really high level competitive athlete, is most of the people who engage in these sports and who often you'll see coming through the door in like the average clinic is like a pedestrian athlete. And so if you scale it down to pedestrian participants, making sure that the people that are engaging at that level understand or are offered some context clues about why they're engaging in the activity in the first place. And one thing that happens regardless of the level of participation is these things get intertwined with our identities. I mean, I know me personally, I feel better when I'm on the mat. Being on the mat and training hard has been a part of what makes me feel good for as long as I can remember. And when I don't have access to it, it's very hard to replicate that thing. Even though I've never competed at an extraordinarily high level, it's a pretty well ingrained part of my personality and my identity. Even if the rationale for discontinuing participation is rock solid, taking somebody's identity away from them is a hard thing for them to swallow, even when they're not totally conscious of it, that the thing that makes me feel like me might go away or I can't participate. And regardless of any like biomechanical realities that the person's facing, those are powerful motivations that are behind the pursuit of the activity or making dumb choices, or if you add on top of that professional level, making money, providing for your family, the ties to toughness and honor that are sort of implicitly attached to these sports in general. So those are just some thoughts that came to mind for me.
Yeah, one of the things I can add is if every athlete, doesn't matter what their sport is, every athlete hates the position. Say, okay, you have X injury, stop, right? Like, because that's not the answer that they want. They're not going to do that. So that's why you need to have a clinician or a coach who has an understanding of the activity saying, maybe I can't do this, but what can I do? And I think that's better. And obviously there's going to be some injuries that keep people off the mat. Like there was some jackass reach out to me and he was like, "Oh, my training partner just had a major surgery with staples in his knee and he's drilling on the mat." I'm like, "Oh my God." Like not only I don't even know what surgery is, but anything with staples, it's open surgery, it's bad. It's it could be something. And the guy's like, "Yeah, well, he that's all jujitsu is all he has." And it was like, okay, and I can get then I can empathize because obviously there's going to be that, satisfaction of getting to train. But what can you do? So when I'm working with an athlete, you have to understand what the injury is, what phase of injury, and then I can kind of give them a better guideline of what they can or can't do.
Yeah, give them a way to scratch the itch a little bit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And my I know you work with Greg Saunders. That kind of change his eco pushing in jiu-jitsu is kind of messing my return to sport plan up, but that's okay. Now that eco is growing, it just changes things.
I think a really good point on that is a lot of they're super eager. A lot of these guys are super eager, super into their sport, and as you guys have mentioned, this is a big part of their week, their days of who they are. So I think you can remove some of that. Some of the poor decisions they make is just from anxiety. They're just unclear. They're unsure of what that means for them. So giving them a very clear idea as much as you can about what this pathway back to what they want to do looks like, and then what that will take and the time. I think that can remove some of the anxiety. Not necessarily going to remove some of the poor decision making, but at least if you can say that gives you more power to say no to certain things. You go, hey, for now, I don't want you to do this, but you can return to that here, which means this, and just giving them a bit of a clear roadmap, which is not the easiest thing to do, particularly in grappling sports. But if you can give them a bit of a roadmap that they can kind of contextualize and wrap their head around, that's also something that if they do go back to the gym or they're on the mats, and that gives them something to talk to their teammates about, because that's all they want to do, right? You got this injury, they're like, well, when can you get back and roll? And just giving them something to bite their head on and sort of map it, I think removes anxiety and then hopefully limits some of those re-injuries that might happen down the track.
I love that point that you just brought up, Tim, on really, bringing the education piece to the forefront for the jiu-jitsu athlete or the martial arts athlete and understanding that plan and pathway back. Because I feel like a lot of times in this space, the athlete or the clinician does not fully understand what that pathway back looks like. They get told, well, you need to come see me 3 times a week. You need to pay your $50 a visit copay, and we'll see where we land in 12 to 15 visits. When in reality, that's not going to fly with this population. I think you have to know that the end goal is to get back onto the mats, and you have to understand what that's going to look like for them. And as you all outlined earlier, all the different considerations that go into that, whether that's, hey, this is their livelihood, this is how they make money, or hey, they're literally just relying on the accident insurance that covered the event that they were at to, cover the entire cost of their rehab, and they have nothing more that they can pour into it. Understanding all of those other factors and then kind of reverse engineering your plan from there, and understanding that it's going to look different based on every injury, because no two injuries are going to present the same way. I think that the more we kind of go about taking that end goal and then reverse engineering our plan from that, and then putting into respect the different biological healing timelines and other criterion that we need to meet in order to get there. And I think this is an area where, Mike, you mentioned before that you're always posting infographics on Instagram. I think you do a really good job at kind of highlighting some of those different timeline and criterion that go into getting someone back to the mats. It's not enough to just say, hey, it's been 9 months since ACL surgery, get back on the mats. There has to be a little bit more in-depth and detail that goes into that. And I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts on what goes into that process of reverse engineering a plan to get someone back on the mats, whether that's ACL or shoulder, whatever kind of injury that way. How do we kind of build that plan or progression back?
I guess the way I look at it is first rules, obviously we have to take tissue healing into consideration. If the tissue isn't healed, there's nothing we can do. But it's not the only thing. I posted something once about, tissue healing and everyone was so excited. I was like, I even said it in the notes, like I don't clear anybody solely on tissue healing time. Like, yeah, the timing helps and it matters, but it's not the only thing. So then the next we can look at like joint specific. Can the injured joint do what it's supposed to, and or can it tolerate the resilience of sport? So it's like, okay, well, you take some of the movements milestones for grappling, right? Like, can you have a full kneel? Can you pull a deep squat? Those are just some basic movement things. And then, but like it doesn't end there because in jiu-jitsu, you're gonna have somebody who's gonna be like torquing on your leg, trying to break it, right? So, that's why you have to make sure that that injured tissue can tolerate what's going to happen. And then that last component is going to be sport specific. So obviously you have to make sure that enough time has happened, the joint can do what it's supposed to, but then now that we're reintegrating sport activities, how does the athlete do? Because again, the knee could do everything it's supposed to, but like they've been out for however many months. Are they ready for that? And I can use those sport specific activity to give me a little bit better idea of where they're at. Like if they're still struggling, I'm gonna have to pull them back from certain things, or if they're doing great, I can check that off and kind of continue past.
I think that was a brilliant recap on it. I'll try and just add a little bit extra cream on top. I guess it's as you said, Mike. Like, the human physiology is human physiology. At the end of the day, like you need to allow tissue healing, create a homeostatic environment, and then you can go from there. That doesn't change. I guess the difference is you need to understand what are those particular stresses that sport is going to put on the joint, and that might, like they're going to get arm bars, right? Can the joint actually tolerate and produce force in the range, things like that. And then I guess once you've got those physical qualities back, the layering back of the sport can be the tricky part. And I think when you've got one sport, it's obviously very tricky in a way that you're trying to fill time, you're trying to build things out. I think with MMA you also have the complexity that you're trying to almost do three different sports in one. You're trying to layer striking on top of wrestling and then on top of grappling, and then you're trying to figure out when does that all fit and then what takes priority at certain times. But I think one way I like to think about it is once you've built those physical qualities, and that includes strength, mobility, etc., then you build back the skill of the movement, and that could be like Mike, you said, that could be can you kneel? Can you do a deep squat? Can you produce functional movements? And then can you produce some of those basic skills that you need for the sport? And then you go into drills. So then can you layer in some drills, and then you start to add that up? Now that might be, you might start in guard, or you might be on top, or whatever those positions is, and you start to lay that on and obviously go from a less stressful to a more stressful environment. Then you're including some live work, but situationally, and that might be starting on your back or starting in guard, or you might just start with some clinch work on your feet, and obviously not transitioning between up and down, because that's where you come into trouble a lot of the time. And then once you progress through those and you're pretty happy, then you let it go. So then you can start creating more chaos and go into no-gi or any type of sparring and things you want. So I think, yes, it is different, a little bit difficult when you've got these sports, and particularly sports that aren't locomotive. A lot of the classic things for lower limb return have running built into them, and then that's just somewhat irrelevant for your jiu-jitsu athletes. So that kind of goes out the window. But I think you still go back to basics, get the healing right, get the injured tissue back, get them moving in the right way, introduce drills, introduce situational live work, and then once they tick those boxes, then you can get back into it. That's kind of how I like to frame it in my head.
I actually have a question. So with all the expertise in combat sports that you brought in here, and do you guys know, when you look across like the pantheon of sports medicine and sports performance, it seems like, generally speaking, especially in field sports, we have this really nice understanding of force profiles that are given in different shapes, patterns, movements, transitions. And then based on those force profiles, we have like reasonable key performance indicators upon which the return to play process is built and the strength and conditioning is built. And maybe I'm just totally ignorant to it, but is there anything other than I've seen both of the meta-analyses that the PI has put out, other than those, is there any consensus in literature, or is there any investigation into like what are the force profiles that are actually in these athletes' bodies? Because in combat sports, you not only play the sport with your body is also the field of play. I don't know. Does anybody have a sense of the answer to that question?
I know something like that doesn't exist for jujitsu, like any data I found with physical profile comparing. But I think even though like, mixed martial arts and Brazilian jiu-jitsu are obviously tied in, I think that wrestling and judo probably do a better job with that, just because if you look around the world, like those are like far bit better, bigger sports. You're going to have better athletes. So I think for the context of like grappling or mixed martial arts, looking at like a judoka or a wrestler would probably be a better answer, because everything they've looked at for jiu-jitsu is they're generally just going to be a worse athlete. But that kind of, again, it's still a growing sport. That might change in, 10 or 20 years, but right now I haven't seen it.
Yeah, there's definitely profiling in freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling. There's profiling in judo as well. Most of it is, though, it is very field assessment based. I think it's still pretty infantile when it comes to the accuracy levels of like research caliber data. So you're looking at, higher density metrics with force plates and metabolic assessments and things along those lines. There's not quite as much. The one thing that I kind of have a question around too, that's always seems to be a challenge. And a lot of these normative sports, field-based sports, team-oriented sports, there's usually at least baseline profiling that's done when they come in. There's like enrollment processes where, they're going their general physicals to blood work to biomechanical assessments, you name it. And in a lot of these sports, which start out as a club, I mean, kind of a club, you're going to join a gym, you're paying for lessons, and there's no real baseline understanding. So, as you go through that rehab process, it's nice in some of these cases to be able to refer back to, well, what was the baseline capability of that joint or that particular athlete before they got injured? And in a lot of these cases, you just don't have that. So how do you guys ever found anything resourceful where you were able to uncover something like that, either from maybe a previous injury that sparked an assessment process? I mean, I know at the PI, we do intakes where you get baselines on folks, at least when they come in, but if they come in at 36 years old, that's not really a baseline. It's just where they're at 36 years old. But curious if you guys have uncovered any other resources to be able to get at least some picture of what maybe a baseline or functionality of that or capability of that person prior to engaging in those combative sports.
Yeah, I don't think that really exists, unfortunately. You take like judo, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, for the most part, they're all amateur sports. If you want to make money, you go into MMA. Like that's just the answer, the way it's been. I think it might start to change with jiu-jitsu, because now after like the Craig Jones Invitational, people are winning like $1 million. So like that could start changing. So yeah, like it's kind of tough. For me, the best that I can do, and just this is just a metric that we can use in rehab, is just limb symmetry index. Someone comes with an injury, we can assume that in some level that injured limb is probably, or it was pretty close to the other one. So I can use that as a metric. Then we can consider like some level of deconditioning. So in like almost every literature I've looked at for limb symmetry index, we're looking at like 90%. A lot of clinicians would actually say, well, again, if you have something like an ACL injury, you've been off for like 9 months, maybe 95 is a better percent, because that unaffected leg could have gone through some level of deconditioning.
Yeah, I guess and this is a very unique population at the PI and within the I guess in Shanghai and Mexico we have the academy setting. So for those, I guess this is not familiar, we do an intake every year. We do a combine where we take the best 20 to 25 athletes from the region. So that might be Asia or Latin America. And as part of that combine, we do a series of baseline tests, which includes like a medical intake. We kind of review those tests every three to 6 months, and that sort of creates a rolling baseline. Like, so for example, with the medical screen, we'll do a full orthopedic or an MSK evaluation, which is essentially range of movement and stability around joints. And then we'll do a neurocognitive assessment for concussion. And we'll also do some strength profiling around key injury sites. So we'll do like some isometric strength testing of the shoulder, so like internal, external rotation. At the moment, we're using a fixed frame dynamometry to do it. We're still trying to refine that process, and we do have some early baselines on that data. For example, you want at least 2.5 to 3 newtons per body weight of external rotation to be, to clear a threshold. Obviously, these numbers jump up and down, right? Because we've got a very heterogeneous group. We've got some guys that come in, have a full history in jiu-jitsu versus striking. So you get these wildly different profiles, but we've got some baselines. We do our neck profiling at the moment again on the fixed frame, and we've got some baselines and some profiles that we want on that. And then we also do the hip. So we've got an idea of how much, general force in adduction, abduction, and then what ratios we want for that with our guys. Again, it is tricky though, because you get that information. That's what do you do with it, right? We have an idea that we want them to reach a certain level, but because it's so up and down, it's like, do we dive into an intervention here? But we don't even know if that's going to help. One of the ones is like grip strength. Obviously, with that is a performance metric for grapplers. They got to have strong hands, so we use that as a, if guys are weak with their grip strength, it kind of tells us they haven't grappled much. So that it's almost like it's on a performance screen as well, but definitely that then into like our striking athletes. If you're dropping 20% off your peak grip strength, you've probably got some pathology in that hand and wrist. And that's some stuff from British boxing. So we kind of have those baselines with the academy guys that come in, much harder within the UFC rostered guys, because they, as Bo, you alluded to, they come in and out, and they might come in when they're 35 and you never see them again. So that's something we're trying to build out. But that is a very, very unique situation where we've got a house of full-time athletes that we have access to 24/7 that we can do that on. But the idea is grabbing that information, getting good data over 2 or 3 years, and then we can release it to everyone when we actually know if it's useful. Like, the worst thing we could do is go, here's the numbers that we think all MMA athletes should have. And then everyone strives for those numbers. And then 2 years later, we come back and go, actually, that wasn't correct, but thank you for doing all this stuff. So we're trying, we're trying to build that stuff out. But what I can definitely say is just like, they're not consistent. They're not like baseballers where you'll get very consistent numbers. It's not like footballers where your adduction, abduction ratios might be even. These guys just go all over the place. So it's a work in progress.
I think on that note as well, especially in the just general outpatient sports ortho practice, this is an area where having conversations with the people that you work with is absolutely crucial, because the majority of the athletes that I see that have that kind of wrestling or jiu-jitsu background that are coming in clinically, this is their first real exposure to like organized sports science, whether that's force plate testing or basic isometric break testing, make testing, whatever you want to call it that way. And I think a lot of the times you have to just sit down and have a conversation with them and try and understand what they were doing before, what different things looked like. And I've gone for any and every little bit of information that I can grab. Sometimes people are like, yeah, I used to squat certain amount of weight for certain amount of reps. And I'm like, okay, well, that's better than nothing to go off of. It's not perfect, but I like to have some kind of idea of how to paint a picture of where they were before. And then ultimately with these kind of sports, as we've been talking about, I have the goal of getting them back stronger than they were before. So wherever we were at before obviously was not enough to prevent injury. And obviously when you get into some of the more advanced levels of, take jiu-jitsu, for example, if you're at a level where you're doing something like a heel hook in your training, like that's a very, it's a move that's very technical. And it's something that I want to make sure that if we're clearing the athlete to go back to that we've done anything and everything we can to build a high level of physical strength and just overall physical resiliency. So try and paint that picture as best you can of what they were doing before and where they were at, and then try and blow that status out of the water and get them to a whole new level of function, because the stronger and more resilient they are, the more successful that return to sport process is going to be.
Mike, I'm kind of curious, not being around the really competitive side of jiu-jitsu here recently. What is the current kind of, or I'd say current, maybe last 5-6 years worth of injury audit look like? Where do the percentages lie? How much of it is lower extremity, upper extremity, neck, whatever? What's that look like these days?
Best data is the one I collected 2021. So that's when the IBJF cleared heel hooks to be legal in certain divisions. So I was kind of curious like how the injury rates were going to change. I think it's been pretty consistent though that knee injuries are still by far the most commonly injured joint in all grappling, whether it's judo, wrestling, or jiu-jitsu. With the addition of heel hooks, like the knee injuries, they went up 120%, so it definitely affected things. Ankle injuries were actually surprisingly high with the data that I had, but if you look at all of the data of what's out there, usually it goes knee. Rib is actually a fairly common one, rib injuries are kind of interesting to check for like in competition because a lot of the data that I looked at was like looking at joint specific versus tissue specific. And I think that a joint injury tends to be more of like an accumulation micro trauma versus like a big macro trauma, like someone just popped your arm. I mean, there are going to be times you pop your rib. I think it goes knee, rib, shoulder, and then it kind of goes down. When it comes to competition, because a lot of the data that I'm looking at is looking at global, like people training and competition, which changes, right? So the elbows is still the pretty much the most commonly injured joint in competition. But again, what's the most common attack? It's going to be an armbar. So I think that's kind of what I would say for when it comes to for injury profiles.
Anything else you've seen change, I guess, particularly recently in the last couple of years with injury profiles, even if it's anecdotally? Are you seeing a change with, I guess, technical and tactical decisions? Obviously, jiu-jitsu is building up, and I don't know whether seems like there's more almost wrestlers crossing across, right? Where there's a bit more sort of no-gi and there's a bit more stand-up and transition from up to down, whereas maybe that wasn't the case 5-10 years ago. Is that something else that you've seen, particularly the last 12 months, that there really, really is another profile change?
I would say the one data that might change is again in the data that I collected, we saw an increase in ankle injuries, but then like most recently, there's been a uptick in straight ankle locks. Like for a long time, like once heel hooks became popular, straight ankle locks were considered like kind of a garbage move. Like no one's going to tap to that. Like, and I've been in a competition, I've had my ankle popped and I didn't tap, and it is what it is, right? And like you take like UFC fight, like people are gonna like literally get their like limbs destroyed because if they tap, they could lose out on like six figures. So, you know, even then, which is hilarious because jiu-jitsu guys like they'll make no money and they'll have the same kind of approach. So like you could win this gold medal that means nothing in a naga, and I'm like, yeah, I'll let my knee snap. But I would say over the last ADCC, we saw a very big increase in straight ankle locks, and I think it just better braking mechanics. For a long time, people just kind of like wrote it off, and heel hooks are easier to get. But then now that heel hooks have been popular for about 10 years, defense is better. And a lot of times the defense to a heel hook is going to be the way that you attack the straight ankle lock. They kind of go back and back. So I would say like with the changes in the braking mechanics, the ankle injury is definitely increased.
For the joint locks in particular, what do you feel is essential for the coach or rehab clinician to know and understand about those? And on top of that, there's a lot of trendy stuff nowadays, especially in the age of Instagram, on sport-specific training. And is there really a sport-specific exercise element that goes into preparing someone for these joint locks, or is just getting someone back on the mats and exposing them to jiu-jitsu again, enough of that sport-specific element for them?
So I guess with sport specific, and I think everyone here is a strength and conditioning coach. So I'm interested how you guys agree. Back in the day, I think originally the reason why the UFC PI got non-combat athletes is because there was a lot of hokey shit out there. So they're like, okay, like what are like real athletes doing? Like what is football doing? And I think, so that's when they started to actually have like better strength and conditioning, like better GPP going. The one thing that I would argue, because obviously strengthening is obviously going to be important for reducing injury. It's just pretty consistent. One of the things that I would do in addition to things is one of the things we know about strength training is that it's range of motion specific. So again, a deep squat, obviously strengthen that versus a partial squat. Partial squat's only going to strengthen that range. So one of the things that I include with my people is I want to make sure that we strengthen a degree of freedom where these injuries occur. So something like a heel hook, like I include a lot of rotational isometrics in the knee to make sure that like if someone puts them in a heel hook, I know their knee isn't going to explode. Same for shoulder. How do shoulder injuries happen? They tend to be rotation. One of the things you commonly see is people only do shoulder rotation in rehab versus like the type of stuff that I'm doing for my shoulder rotation is high intensity to failure to kind of make sure I get that adaptation. So I would say not necessarily sport specific, but just like tissue range of motion specific in addition to having like sound strength conditioning fundamentals.
Yeah, man, I completely agree with that. I think there's you can also you got to attack that range that they're going to be exposed to, but also if you're trying to adapt the specific tissue that might get injured, like if it's joint-based pathology, a lot of the time it's, ligamentous tissue that's going to be damaged. So if you're trying to stimulate growth of ligament, you got to move some heavy stuff. You got to put it under a fairly heavy load, and it's obviously some time under tension is how you're going to really adapt that non-contractile tissue. So I think that strength training adaptation stuff is really important to create some resilience. Obviously, you still need to maintain the mobility with it. One of the big things that sort of we've seen is if you try and, for example, the neck, right, you can get these guys who have amazingly strong necks, but how much is strong enough? And then at some point, if you just keep building muscle mass and strength and just keep adding and adding, they lose mobility. And then all of a sudden you start getting issues. So there's like this sweet spot of strength and mobility that you're trying to find with athletes, which is all particularly individual. But one interesting thing we did see here in Mexico recently is we obviously have we had a new intake of athletes, and a lot of them hadn't had exposure to good sound strength and conditioning. A lot of them were good athletes in a sense, but particularly some of our more junior guys and some of the females there, wrestling was good because they were good athletes, not because they were technically sound. And then they went through a beautiful block of strength training and we were blowing the strength numbers out of the water, and then they started hurting themselves because all of a sudden we've given an athlete who's got this newfound superpower of strength, but their technical and tactical decision making was still average because that takes longer to learn. And then all of a sudden we'll get in a spate of knee injuries because we've given these girls a beautiful new isometric mid-thigh pull. So there is this like continuum of, you want to give them strength, but at the right to match their technical skills and all this kind of fun stuff. So we've seen some very interesting things over time here, but that is always the age-old question, like how strong is strong enough? And it's a fun one that we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that because obviously, like with jiu-jitsu, there's like a point of really any sport, but there's a point of diminishing return. So it's like, obviously need a baseline strength, which I'm sure you guys for obviously MMA are going to have that answer. Like what's kind of like what we're looking for. And then at what point do we transition? Because then there's some people that are like, they're spending so much time in the strength room. And one of the things we all know is that the strongest guy in the gym isn't always the best athlete. So, and I think that sometimes that gets forgotten. One of the things for jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu being more of a dynamic isometric strength sport versus an explosive sport. Like judo, wrestling are going to actually need to be a little bit more explosive and powerful. And this, I think, is probably going to change now that I think the stand up for like wrestling and judo in jiu-jitsu has been a lot better. So it might change. But for the most part, like you don't need to be a fast athlete. Like you look at Gordon Ryan, he's a very slow athlete and he crushes people. I mean, there's other things that he does, like he makes the rule set kind of tailored to him, like he does his 30-minute rounds. But yeah, that's always interesting. It's like, what is the point where it's like you've reached your, it's not worth spending more time to improve. You want to switch to like a maintenance program.
I'm sure Bo and Rob, you guys could probably touch on this a little bit better, but something we've tried is, let's say like a mid-thigh pull, right? We're trying to have a level that if they hit this, then you're good, right? And whatever that means. So if, as opposed to 3 lifts a week, they might go to 2 lifts a week. And then some guys might even go to 1 lift a week, depending on what you're trying to do, and put that time into whatever else. It might be mobility work, it might be striking, and particularly for MMA, there's so many different things you can spend that time on. So trying to figure out that from our baseline data, we're getting a little bit closer, but it is hard because then some guys are strong, but they don't use it in their sport. So it does become a little bit tricky. And obviously the other thing is obviously with weight making sports, right? Sometimes you just get them too strong and they put on a bunch of muscle and all of a sudden it's a lot harder to make their weight. So we've had that problem as well. Guys come into the gym and they just look at them and all of a sudden they're super jacked and now they can't make bantamweight anymore. We're going, oh shit, sorry, bro. So there's all those extra little things as well that make it a little bit difficult.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say, I think when you say like weight training or strength training, it kind of gets summated into this like general term, but I mean, honestly, their training should be fundamentally targeted first off. So there's got to be a relative level of strength to even compete at that level relative to body mass. These are weight classification sports, and I know they float up and down, but relative strength being the most important. And then how much is strength part of your game? And for some, it's frankly not. So looking at things like joint integrity, that's different than trying to push the ceiling height of someone's absolute strength because that's what they compete with. And we've seen those examples of those that, they're more bulldogs than they are technicians. And so what kind of game is it that you're trying to play? And then when you just peel back from that stuff, just more on the return to play aspect and things along those lines, I think one of the more neglected aspects of finding durability and strength training is vector specific training. So we talked about range of motion specific training, but things that are vector specific. When you're dealing with a lot of rotational torque, not addressing that or not addressing that under load or under controlled constraints, it's definitely leaving a gap. It's leaving an opening. Strength and conditioning coaches are great at linear force production. We're really good at vertical and linear force production. Where the experience plays in is whenever you can get multi-vector, multi-planar with that force production. And I'll piggyback onto Mike a little bit about the time under tension concept. It is constantly under strain, whether you're offensive or defensive, whether you're a little bit more relaxed and poised or you're actually exerting yourself, there's always a little bit of tension. I find like one of the biggest learning curves is, and this would go without injury, is their education on how to brace. Like they don't really get fundamentally educated from the beginning on when I'm bracing, I'm building tension. When I'm exhaling, I'm relaxing. And so we kind of have to teach both because they don't know how to rest and recover. So we spend a lot of time on relaxation techniques and learning how to optimize and exhale. But then also, how do you brace appropriately to withstand a load? When you're doing something continuous, bracing mechanics are different. It's much more of a sipping mechanism and a repeat sipping mechanism versus a gulp when I get ready to maximally brace under a heavy load like a back squat or a front squat or something along those lines. So a lot of times these rehabilitative timeframes can be great interventions for teaching really basic things that they never learned when they started exposing themselves to strength training in the first place. The other thing I'll say is that there's definitely a lot of misconceptions when it comes to strength training being this hypertrophic Achilles heel that keeps people from making weight. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. Most of the time, it's actually easier to pull fluid from muscle tissue than it is from fat tissue. So the leaner they are, it can be easier to cut weight. But a lot of times, what happens in some of these rehab scenarios when they don't have an integrated approach or they don't have a strength coach or even a combative coach communicating with the PT or the medical group is things get isolated. And you take this grappler who's used to doing 14, 18 sessions a week worth of grappling, which is going to be quite a caloric expenditure on its own. And all of a sudden now they're just strength training and eating and watching their buddies roll. And they wonder, why am I getting bigger? Oh, it's my strength training. It's like, well, your overall activity is down. Your primary activity is now lifting weights and eating. You're technically a bodybuilder. And so I think that's, peeling back the layers and really getting to the mechanism on why, because those are the kind of phobias that actually push combat athletes away from the weight room. Those are the kind of phobias that like, coach, I can't lift weights. I want to be stronger, but I can't because I got to stay within my weight class versus looking at the things that actually influence weight, which is your caloric intake and your expenditure. And then, of course, yes, there's definitely a lot of fallacies and weight cutting mechanisms, how they're doing it, the time frames they're doing it in, those sorts of things. But yeah, going back to the original question, I think one that is definitely a gap a lot of times is just that vector specific training. Getting out of the traditional linear modes, we can actually build a lot of false confidence. And oh man, my squat's up 30%, deadlift's up 30%, pressing's up 30%, and they get re-injured. And we scratch our heads like, I don't understand. He's a fortress right now. And it's like, well, in those vectors, yes, but in some of the ones he's encountering repeatedly with another person, trying to surprise him with them, not always expected, not always anticipating. Yeah, those are kind of the scenarios that we're trying to prepare for, which are quite difficult, by the way. I'm not trying to make it sound easy by any means.
One of the things we could talk about that Bo said, which is great, is like strength absolutely matters. But one of the things we can consider too is like a maximal strength production takes what, like 100 to 200 milliseconds to like get to that max force, versus a lot of sporting injuries can happen to like 30 and 40 milliseconds. So one of the best methods of injury prevention, probably the only like real like prevention method, is like positional situational awareness. Like, where is the injury likely going to come? How can we minimize realistically in a combat sport? How can we minimize that person being in that position? Like from a jiu-jitsu perspective, like, I'll work with someone who has a back injury, and then their game is this crazy inversion berimbolo game. And I'm like, man, like, this is not the best way. Like, I'm not saying you cannot get back to that. I'm like, don't do it now. Like sometimes people are kind of ignorant of what they shouldn't be doing. So I think getting that a good understanding of where these injuries occur is probably the best thing that we can do for these athletes.
That's a key point. Whenever, how many jujitsu instructors, even at a really high level when they're working on techniques, are looking at, other than achieving the technique, a biomechanical efficient way of performing that. Like, are you performing that, even though you're technically doing it, you're arbitrarily achieving it? Is that the same as a certain high level standard of executing it? And it reminds me of the weight room, because folks come in just like you say, oh man, I squat X amount, I do that all the time. And then you take experienced eyeballs and put them on that squat, and you're like, hey man, I know you're arbitrarily completing something, but I wouldn't say that that's worth the benefits you're getting out of it from a strength perspective. I know there's some good instructors out there that are very picky about athletes taking risks and things like that, but I would say there's quite a few too that are like, oh, you did it, great, with no evaluation of, hey, what did you put at risk while you were doing it? What kind of position was your neck in? What kind of position was your shoulder in? I don't know how much officiating like that happens on a day-to-day basis in training.
No, I don't think really any. And like generally, the jiu-jitsu coach is like, I'm showing rubber guard today. And it's like maybe a lot of people shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big problem when it comes to teaching. And for me, like, so I teach jiu-jitsu too. So like there's like I can invert and I can do rubber guard, but I don't really teach it because most people can't do it. So for me, like I'm gonna focus on good fundamentals, and then we can add I have this one guy, he's like 58, and you would think that he's a Masters like 7 competitor, and his game is to pull bottom side control and buggy choke from the bottom. It was like here's a game you'd expect from an 18-year-old. He's 58, and you're like, holy shit. But I mean, like for someone like him, I can show all that stuff because he's got the body, he has the physical capacity for this, but not everybody does.
I think that's a super, super interesting point. Like at one point, can we, and this sort of ties back into the profiling, right? Like trying to get an idea of what these athletes look like. And can we match specific profiles of athletes to, tactical decision making? And is that something that we should be doing? Like, it's just, maybe I think a lot of athletes probably almost self-select that way. I'm very mobile through the hips, so I play guard more, or I'm particularly strong, so my game is just to smother, all those kind of things. But I'm trying to, where do we go in 5 or 10 years? Are we getting these athletes in and sort of profiling their range of movement and strength and going, okay, well, and letting that actually guide potential, what their like tactical decision making is? I don't know. That's just kind of where my head goes. When I always try, and when we get the athletes in and we do a full MSK screen and I'm checking their ranges and things, I'm trying to guess, okay, what are you good at? And I'll ask them. And the problem is half the time I'm just wrong. We've got a guy in Mexico who's got the most unbelievable range of motion in his joints that I've seen. Just, like almost a classic hyper lax female where you pick up the foot and the kind of dangles. He's got that in spades, and like total range of hip motion. He's hitting like 120, 130 degrees. He's wild. And I was like, you've got to be just an awesome jiu-jitsu. He's like, my jiu-jitsu is terrible on the striker. I was like, all right, well, I know nothing. I'll just give up and go home. So it's one of those things where it's I'd love to see how that. I'm just super interested to see how the all combat sports, but particularly grappling sports, progress in the future when people are getting in it at a younger age. That are we able to push them to certain decision making in their sport from their physical profiles? And it's just an interesting thought.
I guess that's an interesting piece as well, as far as when do we intervene with that, right? If someone's 58, like Mike mentioned, do we look at them and say, okay, well, I know you've been doing your game like this for 40 years, but you're actually more built like this. So I need you to stop doing that and start doing this. Or do we kind of build it in as more of a long-term athlete development model where we kind of say, hey, like, there's certain standards that everyone doing jiu-jitsu needs to meet. I know that they already kind of have that built in from a belt system standpoint, but I also know that there's a little bit of difference in how certain instructors teach different things and show certain things and so on that way. So is it something where we just kind of expand that kind of like progressive system that goes into the sport itself? And then from there, athletes kind of like are almost more inclined to, you mentioned before about the assessment process, building in more of an assessment process and then tailoring the way we instruct based on how they were assessed in the first place. So if they're more inclined to be a certain type of movement profile that way, they're going to be instructed along those lines more while they still get exposure to other variables that way. And it's something that I feel like is a very complex problem because to a certain extent, we want athletes to kind of do the things they're naturally going to do. But by the other extent, we want to expose them to a variety of different stimuli just from an overall physical preparation standpoint. Because as you all mentioned before, the fights and the matches that they end up in are highly unpredictable. And to a certain extent, it's nice to be really good at certain things, but you also might be put in a position where you can't rely on those things and you have to kind of reach to, your sixth or seventh move down on the list of options to get out of there with a victory.
Listening to you guys, listening to the discussion that's taking place in the last 10 minutes is pretty awesome. One thing, or maybe a couple things that come to mind, if I can try to organize myself here, is first of all, that sometimes as like professionals, we tend to think on a level of, I'm going to intervene and I'm going to tell this athlete what they're going to do. But not only is the expression of an athlete's game a biomechanical expression of their attributes, it's the expression of their personality, right? There's more going on into this pot than just like I have the prerequisite external rotation of my hip to do a certain variation of the triangle. It's that I like it, right? Like some people do things simply because they like it. And in addition to that, no matter how sophisticated any methodology that any jiu-jitsu coach or any strength and conditioning coach or any physical therapist has to deploy, we may not ever have enough access to give the right intervention at the right time. And one of the most frequent lost opportunities that at least I've seen in my experience in all performance return to play environments is the opportunity to educate the athlete about how to self-assess so that they can make their own choices about when they need to force direct or redirect, or at least have a more educated conversation when they have an opportunity to talk to a professional. So I don't have to take away some aspect of your game because I don't think you have enough back range of motion or hip range of motion. I can start exposing you to some formal movement language, which is what the strength and conditioning environment is for. Here are some formal patterns, positions, and expressions of the human body that give us information about these layers of attributes that you have. And then how do those reflect what your capacities are in your given expression of the sport? And then let you start to make your own connections between those two things. And then over time, we're going to have a conversation. And allow the athlete to become educated and autonomous in their self-assessment. And to me, at least thinking long term, that is probably the highest guarantor. And we run into the same thing when we deal with people in the military, right? When you think not just in terms of combat sports, but in combat, we try to do all these sophisticated analyses of these guys and all the chaos that they endure, just like in combat sports, and it's impossible to predict. And so one of the things that ends up being most successful is using the training environment, not just as a place to develop, like build a better car, but to build a better driver. So does this individual even have the tools to develop their own understanding of what is happening, and then how they can they're going to be able to course correct themselves much faster than any high level professional who's looking at them, because they are with themselves all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That one guy I told you about, like, I 100% agree with you. Like, I never told him, don't play this game. And I think that's why he's someone who's interesting because I've worked with him as a physical therapy client. I've worked with him for strength and conditioning, and I also coach him in jiu-jitsu. So it's kind of like weird that I've worked with him in a lot of different ways. But like, I've never told him, don't do this. It's just like, hey, we just want to add. And it's a perfect example, right? So he's a competitor and he goes out and he played his game, and at blue belt he's winning. Now he's a purple belt and he wins some and he loses some. He took third in Master Worlds, but it was that same thing. Like, his game is risky, and if I just told him don't do it, he's not going to listen to me. But I just want to add, so I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, and sometimes that ends up being like a fun target. So it's like you can tell the athlete, like, fine, if you want to play like this, here's what's required of you, and this is the pathway. If you want to be able to do this thing that you like to do as you, and you want to keep doing it, because that's really the job of the support staff, however you square it, is to support the outcome that the athlete wants, not the other way around. So for us, we're like, sure, you can do that. Here's what it costs you. So I'm not here to tell you whether or not to spend money. I'm here to tell you how expensive shit is. So you can spend your knee if you want, or I can help you save that, and then you can have access to this more than once, you know? So that's, at least for me, for both combat sports and when I deal with people in tactical populations, that's kind of the framework, because I just know they're all so damn stubborn that as soon as I do a 360 turnaround, I'm going to come back and seeing them go into what it is that they know, what it is that they're good at, and what it is that they like. Unless I can make a compelling case to do differently and show them a pathway to access what it is that they ultimately want. And that's a really important place that the strength and conditioning and return to play environment can have or can be.
We have to kind of define what our success is in return to sport and return to performance is, if we get them back and then 3 months later, they're back to us with, hey, this is hurting, this is aching, to a certain point, we have to kind of look at ourselves and kind of reflect, because on one hand, I feel like there's a lot of acute soreness that kind of follows jujitsu and that follows grappling sports. If you hit it hard for a couple hours on the mat, you're probably not going to feel 100% afterwards. But by the same token, it's an opportunity for us to look back and reflect and say, did we do our job? Did we adequately prepare this athlete? And sometimes we did, and sometimes we missed something. And I think that ultimately, the more autonomous we can make the athlete and the less likely they are to come back to see us for the same issue again, or even just a comparable issue again, then the better off we're going to be. Because at the end of the day, I think we kind of hit it, multiple times. These guys really just want to roll on the mats, and they don't really care about what exercise you're going to give them or what dosage you're going to give them or why 3x12 is better than 3x10 or whatever. That way, they don't care. They just want to be on the mats doing what they want to do. And if you can give them additional tools to help them stay there, and I've even gone into like refining how we just kind of prepare for the jujitsu session that way is, clinically, I've been doing a lot of different trials and trying to understand the acute effect of isometric exercise on different metrics that way. And I've given a number of different athletes just isos as part of their warm up before they go out and do their rolling on the mats. And people are like, hey, I feel great. I feel a lot better. And I'm like, good. Like, you don't need to come back and see me if you're doing what you want to do. You're doing it safely and you feel good doing it. Like, my job is done at that point. And I think the more that we go about preparing the athlete for those things, and the more we kind of expand their own toolbox, the better off we're going to be. And going back to what we talked about before too, that's where the conversation with the athlete is so important, because if you can kind of tell them, hey, look, I can save you time, I can save you money, and I can keep you doing the things that you want to do. You just have to buy into doing certain things regularly. I think that goes a long way with this population.
Yeah, I think one of our with all our rehabs that we take through, we try and have like a reflective session once they're back, and just sort of how good do we do it. And I think that sort of the three main touch points are performance. Like, do we actually get them back to the level of performance they need to be? Was it efficient? Like, how long did we take? Was it a grade 1 ankle that took us 6 weeks, or were we at the right time? And then how resilient are they going forward? So were they sore during the process, and did they re-injure after? So they're the kind of the three key pillars that we're kind of using at the moment. And if we tick those three off, generally, we're pretty happy. And I think having that as when that feedback's coming, we know we're all going to sit down and reflect on that at the end of the process. And I think that almost, not as a scare tactic, but it's a motivator, right? You're all thinking, okay, well, am I giving this guy a hard enough strength? Am I giving them enough of an input that they're going to be ready to go? When they're back, do I need to give them continued maintenance work to make sure they don't re-injure? And are we going quick enough? Because realistically, time is money, and it obviously depends whether what level they're at and things like that, and do they have a big fight coming up, or are they in an off camp, and that kind of modulates how much time you have and how much you'll do. But realistically, time is money, so that's something you're always going to go is if we gave them 3 sessions or 4 sessions or whatever it is a week, is that going to make it better? So that's what we're using. I think it's a nice consistent point, and I think that you can use that across all ranges of the sport and all different types of combat sports.
One thing I really wanted to bring up and hear your thoughts on is on the acute side of things that way. And Rob, you kind of mentioned a bit about it before. If you're the athlete and you're feeling a certain way after rolling or after competition, where do you draw the line as far as, hey, this is something I need to get checked out versus, hey, I'm good to keep going? How do athletes kind of develop that system of understanding what is normal just from the fact that they're doing a combat sport versus what is, hey, I really need to get this checked out. This is something that's actually concerning that way. What goes into that kind of like process of understanding the acute injury? And, on top of that as well, is there anything that's been really successful to managing those acute injuries? Because, take, your example of the low grade stuff there, Tim. I've seen some people who can get back after, a low grade soft tissue injury in a week, 10 days. And I've seen others that stick around for 6 to 8 weeks. And obviously the time and money factor is drastically different between those two. So is there anything that's really worked well from your eyes in that kind of management process there?
Well, I guess for acute injury, it's super hard to say. Some metrics I use, people have resting pain, that's probably not good. Resting pain, not soreness, like there's aching, that's not good. Usually what I tell people is there's certain things that I know are definitely a problem. You're having radiating symptoms down your arms and legs, that's bad. You're unable to bear weight, that's bad. You feel your knees unstable, that's bad. So these are just like some quick things that are fairly easy because obviously like someone could have, like I've had like a ankle sprain from like I did a jiu-jitsu competition and then I told my wife we were going to go to Disney World after. I was like, there's no fucking way I'm not going to Disneyland. She's going to kill me. So I went anyway, whether I was supposed to or not. There's not, and like with jiu-jitsu too, like people are going to go in with these mild injuries. So again, I use those and those kind of metrics as easy ones. And then other ones is if you have to like significantly modify your jiu-jitsu, you should probably get it checked out.
One interesting piece that's happened in both China and Mexico with our athletes is obviously with the guys we're getting in who are pros but have no access to really any medical, and that's kind of why we've put the PIs there. Is they've gone from nothing, so they just kind of battle through and they figure it out themselves, and then all of a sudden we bring them into a high performance environment. We give them everything. We're there every day. They can access us 24/7. And that becomes an issue because the health literacy is not great. So then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I got to tell these guys everything. So they'll come down and be like, my foot's sore. And I'm like, okay, why? And they're like, I kicked someone. I'm like, okay. They're like, sweet. And I'm like, sweet. That's the end of the conversation. So there's this process, and we've had the coaches come and talk to us both times where they're like, guys, no offense, but they're a little bit soft now. I don't know what you did to them, but they're all a little bit soft. So there's this balance, and that's happened both times, the exact same timelines, the exact same conversations, and that's from Asian athletes who live in Tibet versus guys we've got from the mountains in Chile. So there's this continuum of you want to support, but you've got to make sure they're athletes. They're going to war, so it's trying to figure out these balances of being nice but not too nice. So I just think that's something that was always popped up, and I always found it a really interesting one. But one of the things we try and do is just make an estimate almost, right? Like your foot's sore. If it's a fracture, it's going to be sore after 5 days. If it's not, it's probably going to feel a little bit better. Make an estimate and then just give them a yes or no. And if it's still bad at that point, you can do a little bit more. I think sometimes if you've got access to endless imaging, that's a little bit different. But obviously with your amateur athletes, you sort of got to give them a baseline and kind of work within that, kind of what we tried to do.
For people who want to find out more about you all that way, where can they find you at online? And what kind of resources do you all have to kind of help for people who might want to learn more about, managing the martial arts athlete that way?
I'll be quick. My social media and stuff's pretty boring these days. It's all kids and and outdoors and stuff like that. But one thing, I'm always willing to have discussions. I'm always going to be a fight nerd. I'm always going to be a grappling nerd. So my IG handles is at bo.sandoval. Pretty simple. I will say that, the open forums for having these discussions and things, like, they're still few and far between. So generating more and more of them, I think, is definitely helpful. I know there's a lot of practitioners that feel like they're kind of just isolated, don't have a lot of areas to bounce ideas off of or to gain any professional knowledge off of in these kind of areas. But I can speak that any of the gentlemen on this little episode here have had a ton of interactions and probably have the willingness to interact. So I'll offer myself out there, but feel free to reach out anytime. I could be slow to return sometimes, but I always do.
Cool. Best way to reach for me is on Instagram, Dr._kickass. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. This easily could have been like 3 hours. I would wish I had more time to pick everybody's brain because we could all learn from each other and do all these unique, situations. Unfortunately, I cannot hang out. For any resources, I do have a physical therapy course online. It's called Treating the Jiu-Jitsu Athlete. So if you're a physical therapist and you want to know a little bit more on my thoughts, that's the best way to do it. Thanks, guys.
For me, LinkedIn's a pretty good access point. So just search Tim Roberts on LinkedIn and UFC. I'll probably pop up. Otherwise, my email, which I'll share with you, Dan, and put in the notes. I'm pretty quiet other than that on social media. But yeah, as everyone sort of said, we've got to a point of experience from help from everyone else, right? And the combat community's always happy to help out and always happy to share information. And the more we do that, it's just going to make caring for our athletes and building performance is always going to improve. So anytime, reach out and hopefully I can answer some questions.
For me, you can find me on social media at Prepare to Perform or at the Check Engine Light on Instagram, or Wilson Health and Performance Systems. Always happy to chat. Again, Dan, thanks for having this. I think, as Bo said, and as Tim mentioned, this kind of open discourse is really important. And I talk to jiu-jitsu coaches, especially, with a lot of frequency. My own coaches, friends I have who are in the business, who travel and teach and work with various levels of MMA and grappling athletes. A lot of them feel very siloed. And so I think it's really good to start having more public conversations and developing higher levels of standards of care for athletes who do what is arguably the hardest sport on earth. Yeah, thanks.
Exactly. I mean, the more we kind of bring this stuff to the limelight, the better we're all going to be as coaches, as clinicians, and hopefully the athletes themselves as well. I think for too long, we've all been, seeing the system just plagued by poor outcomes and poor results. And for too long, a lot of people have just said good enough. So I certainly think it's time for us all to do better. And obviously today was a big part of that. So I really appreciate everyone's time and willingness to come on and share their knowledge and insights that way. Now, of course, the most important question, Rob, Bo, when are you two going to be rolling together? And where do I put money on the fight here? I don't know if I'm leaning more towards Rob or Bo on this one, but where can I bet on this?
I'll help out your odds. So I haven't touched a mat in about 2.5 years, and Rob is on the mat pretty frequently. I'll give it a go, but I'll tell you where to put your money.
It's all friendly. It's all friendly. Bo, we got to get you back on the mat, sir.
I'm sure it's coming. I don't have any good excuses,
It's
but
only so many hours in a day, and you got to spend 20 of them hunting.
true.
Oh man, really appreciate your time today, guys. Thank you for everything.
All right, sir.